Before we begin, we have to pre-fit everything for the rocket. You must do sanding, make sure everything pre-fits on the motor tube, all these centering rings. They should fit snug, not super tight, just snug so you can slide the centering rings onto the motor tube. We have to pre-fit, make sure these fin slots are sanded to fit each fin tab, because they come pretty tight. So we want to make sure these come so they're sanded properly for a good fit. That's the most important part of building a rocket, is always pre-fitting everything before you apply epoxy. It's a 5-minute epoxy. It sets up pretty quick. I'd say the pot life of this epoxy is about 2.5 minutes, and it starts getting gummy. So once you pre-fit everything and everything is satisfactory fit, you may apply the epoxy and put your parts together. Take your sandpaper and generously sand your motor tube, the whole tube like this. There might be a glassine film on here that's on here during the production of the tube. And lightly sand it so we have adhesion of the part and the epoxy. After you sand some of the parts, always make sure that every part fits on here in a snug fashion, not too loose. If it's too loose, be careful, because you don't want to knock this off center as you install it or as the epoxy dries, and it'll be on there crooked. Okay, once you've done all your sanding and all the parts have fit properly on each component, mark your motor mount tube a 1/2 inch. Make a mark on one side, turn it 180 degrees, and make another mark on the other side with a pencil. This is going to be a reference line to where your aft centering ring is going to be glued, and that mark should be on the aft end of that centering ring once you glue it on, but we're not going to be doing that right now. Before mounting the centering rings onto the motor tube, find a straight location to mark a straight line. You could use the door jamb is the best, straightest thing that you can find in the house or a building or your classroom or where you're going to be building your rocket, and draw a line from the top to the bottom up against the door jamb like this for a nice perfectly straight line. Okay, once you've marked your reference marks for your rail buttons, do the same thing. Come up to a door jamb or any straight level object like this, and make sure the top is touching the door jamb and the bottom is touching the door stop or door jamb, and draw a line about halfway up from the airframe all the way down to your reference marks. Make sure they're lined up right. You should have a perfectly straight line for your rail buttons for alignment. Okay, once you've established a nice straight line on your motor tube, take your aft centering motor mount ring and draw a line down the center of the slot. Do it on your aft and do it on your middle or your mid ring also. Do the best you can. Okay, once you establish a straight line, line up the crosshairs of the motor mount tube along with the motor centering rings that you've made the line where the notches are, just like this. Make sure they're lined up and straight with each other. This way, this will provide a straight aerodynamic fin profile. Once you put your fin together like that, it'll be nice and straight. It's already preset for you and lined up. No need for a fin jig of any type unless you, if you have one handy, go ahead and use it. The tape I'm using is just an example to keep the centering rings onto the motor mount tube. Do not use masking tape. I just have this for an example. Apply your epoxy. Put your gloves on. Open up your epoxy bottle. There's a cap inside the epoxy bottle. And the best way is to take it off with your knife or a screwdriver. Top it off and discard the cap. All it is just for shipping. Put the cap back on. Of course, you have a hardener and you have a resin. You might have different colored bottles. And then take your X-Acto knife and just cut just above the last ridge. Do the same thing for the other bottle. Pop it off, discard cap. Put the cap back on. Pull the tip off, and just right above the last ridge, I should say, the bottom ridge. Should be enough. Okay, what we want to do is reference that half-inch mark that you've marked for your aft motor mount ring. Make sure that reference mark is on the aft end of the aft motor mount ring. Get your fin ready. Get your mid centering ring ready, and make sure that the mid and aft rings are lined up with the crosshairs that you make on the reference marks. This epoxy is mixed 1-to-1 ratio, so it's a good idea to take both of them in your hand like this. Don't take one at a time and put one down. Take both of them in your hand and squeeze, and I would say probably a good nickel or a quarter diameter pour is good from each hardener and resin. Take your craft stick, mix it up. Okay, once your epoxy is mixed, you must work with it very fast. So like I say, it sets up in 2.5 minutes. Back your aft ring off to the edge of the tube, and you'll see your reference mark. Apply epoxy to the motor tube, kind of a generous amount. Don't make it too messy. All the way around the motor tube, up against the motor mount ring. Once you establish that, push the motor mount ring up past that half-inch mark on your motor tube, so that the half-inch mark is just barely showing on the aft end of that motor mount ring. Okay, now quickly before the epoxy gets all set up and glued. Once you've established this, don't forget to line up your reference mark, your crosshairs that you've made with the aft on the line on the motor tube and the line on the aft motor mount ring. It's a good idea to do another pre-fit here before your epoxy sets up, so you know where your mid ring is going to be. So apply more epoxy, back your mid ring towards the aft end. Apply epoxy to the front part of the motor mount tube and your centering ring. And once you've applied enough epoxy all the way around, reference your line up again. Push your mid-centering ring a little bit so you can make sure your fin interlocks in position. And your crosshairs are lined up. And now it's just making your reference lines on both sides of the aft and mid ring, on the back side, the front side, the back side of this and the front side, so you can reference your lineup and your fins will be aerodynamically straight. I would let that sit for about 2 or 3 minutes. I would let this set for about 2 or 3 minutes and go on to the next fin. Do the same thing. You don't need a reference line because you've already established a nice straight even line with the rest of the slats. They should be equally 120 degrees apart from each other. So just apply epoxy. If your epoxy starts getting a little spider webbish, it's time to change a new, mix some more epoxy. Take your reference line that you found right here and apply epoxy to the motor tube and the edge of the tang of the fin. I call this buttering this up. Just a small amount you need on there. You don't need to put a lot, otherwise it'll start dripping on you. Now remember, epoxy wins over gravity, so be careful where your epoxy is dripping to and from. So here you have a nice epoxy adhesion to the motor tube and the fin tab. It's pretty good. Okay, once the fins are set up on the motor tube by the fin tab, we need to add some epoxy to the fin tab and the motor tube for a little extra strength. So we're going to take a big glob of epoxy and put it between the fin tab and the motor tube and make a nice fillet. Do the same thing on the opposite side. Spread it generously before the epoxy sets up. And while you're at it, you can even put it around the motor mount tube and the ring on the mid and the aft. Here, now we got a nice fin fillet between the fin tab and the motor tube. I'd wait a good 15-20 minutes for the epoxy to cure. Your epoxy says 5-minute epoxy. Don't get the idea that you can put your rocket together and fly it the same day. It takes a good 18 to 24 hours to have the epoxy actually cure for flight. This is what it should look like.